had seen enough horrors in his 43 years to think nothing could surprise him anymore. He'd fought in the border wars, watched colonies burn, and lost his wife to a raider attack 5 years ago. But standing in the shadows of the Nexus Station's slave market, watching his twin children being displayed on the auction block like livestock, something inside him broke in a way he'd never experienced before. The twins and David, barely 16 standard years old, stood chained together on the raised platform under harsh violet lights that made their human skin look sickly and pale. The auctioneer, a tall with 6 arms and silver-scaled skin, gestured dramatically as he spoke in the galactic trade language that echoed through the crowded chamber. "Fresh specimens from the Terran colonies," the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying clearly through the translation devices embedded in every collar worn by the slaves. "Young, healthy, and completely untrained, perfect for molding into whatever role your household requires. The female shows exceptional cognitive development, while the male displays remarkable physical resilience. Bidding starts at 5,000 credits for the pair." Gritted his teeth so hard he thought they might crack. The crowds of alien buyers pressed closer, their various appendages reaching out to examine his children like they were examining produce at a market. A hegemony official with insect-like features ran a scanning device over his head while she tried to pull away, her eyes wide with terror. David stepped protectively in front of his sister, earning him a sharp shock from his control collar that dropped him to his knees. 3 months ago, had been working a mining operation on 442C when the hegemony forces arrived. They claimed the planet had been illegally settled by humans who hadn't properly registered their claim with the Galactic Council. It was bureaucratic nonsense. The paperwork had been filed correctly, but somehow it had gotten lost in the system. By the time the mistake was discovered, the hegemony had already declared the entire population as unlawful squatters subject to seizure as compensation for damages to galactic order. Had been off-world when it happened, returning from a supply run to find his home colony nothing but smoking ruins and his children gone. It had taken him weeks of following leads through the criminal underground to track them to this hellish place, spending every credit he had and calling in favors from old military contacts. Now here he was, watching helplessly as strangers bid on his family. The bidding was climbing rapidly. A merchant with purple fur and multiple eyes was locked in a fierce competition with what looked like a private collector from the core worlds. Looked like she was about to faint, while David kept trying to position himself between his sister and the crowd despite the repeated shocks from his collar. 7,000 credits, called out her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. 8,000, countered the core, a human who had clearly embraced the hegemony way of life. He wore expensive robes and had cybernetic implants that marked him as someone with significant wealth and influence. Felt his hands clench into fists, his own people buying and selling children. The betrayal cut deeper than any alien's cruelty could. At least the aliens saw humans as a different species. This man saw and David as commodities despite sharing their heritage. "Going once," the auctioneer called out, raising one of his 6 arms. 8,000 credits to bidder 779. Looked around desperately. He had maybe 300 credits left to his name, nowhere near enough to buy his children's freedom through legitimate means. But legitimate had never been his strong suit anyway. His eyes found the control booth where the auction house security monitored the proceedings. 3 guards, all armed with standard hegemony pulse weapons. The control systems for the slave collars would be housed there, along with the records of ownership transfer. His military training kicked in automatically, cataloging exits, weapon positions, and potential cover. The auction hall had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of rescue attempt, but had spent years learning how to get into places he wasn't supposed to be. The ventilation system ran along the ceiling, probably just large enough for a human to crawl through. The power conduits were exposed near the eastern wall, protected only by a standard security grating. "Going twice," the auctioneer continued, clearly enjoying the dramatic tension. Made his choice. He pulled a small explosive charge from his jacket, a mining charge he'd kept from his last job, originally intended for breaking through rock walls. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to create the distraction he needed. He'd have to time this perfectly. The core was already reaching for his payment device, a satisfied smirk on his face as he prepared to finalize the purchase. Could see, shoulders shaking as she fought back tears, while David's jaw was set in the same stubborn expression he'd inherited from his mother. Sold to bidder 779 for 8,000. The explosion ripped through the eastern wall of the auction hall with a deafening roar. Emergency lights flickered as the main power grid fluctuated, and the crowd erupted into chaos. Aliens scattered in all directions, some toward the exits and others toward whatever cover they could find. The auctioneer dropped behind his podium, all 6 arms covering his head. Was already moving before the debris stopped falling. He sprinted across the auction floor, dodging panicked buyers and overturned chairs. The security guards were shouting into their communicators, trying to coordinate a response to what they assumed was some kind of terrorist attack. And David were still chained to the platform, their control collars sparking from the power surge. Leaped onto the stage and grabbed the chain connecting them, looking for a weak link he could break. The metal was stronger than it looked, designed to restrain species far stronger than humans. Dad whispered, hardly believing her eyes. "I'm here, sweetheart," said, pulling a small plasma cutter from his belt. "I'm getting you out of here." The plasma cutter sliced through the chain in seconds, but the collars themselves would be harder to remove. Each one had a small fusion cell that would deliver a fatal shock if tampered with incorrectly. Needed to get his children to safety first, then worry about the collars later. David was already looking around, assessing their situation with the same tactical awareness his father had taught him during their hunting trips. "Security's moving to secure the exits," he said quietly. "We need another way out." Nodded approvingly. The boy was thinking clearly despite everything he'd been through. "Ventilation system," said, pointing toward a grating near the ceiling. "Can you reach it?" Before David could answer, pulse fire erupted across the auction hall. The security guards had spotted them and were advancing with weapons drawn. Shoved his children behind the auction podium as energy bolts sizzled past their heads. "Attention criminals," a voice boomed through the hall's public address system. "You are in violation of galactic hegemony law. Surrender immediately and your sentences will be reduced to mere decades in the labor camps." Almost laughed at that. Decades in the labor camps was their idea of mercy. He knew exactly what happened to humans who crossed the hegemony. They disappeared into the prison industrial complex and were never seen again. His children would be returned to the auction block, probably after being conditioned to be more compliant. "Stay down," he told and David, then popped up long enough to return fire with his own weapon, a modified hunting rifle that packed considerably more punch than its appearance suggested. The pulse bolt took one of the security guards in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. The remaining guards took cover behind overturned tables, but could hear more boots approaching from the main entrance. Soon this place would be crawling with hegemony troops. They had maybe 2 minutes before escape became impossible. "The power conduits," David said suddenly. "If we can overload them, it might shut down the collar control system." Looked at his son with pride and surprise. "You've been paying attention to my lessons about electrical systems." "Help me figure it out," David admitted. "She's better with the technical stuff." Managed a weak smile despite their situation. The control booth has to have a manual override for emergencies. If the power surge doesn't work, someone needs to get up there and shut down the system directly. Nodded. His children had grown up a lot during their captivity, learning to work together and think under pressure. But that didn't change the fact that they were still kids, and it was his job to protect them. "New plan," he said, pulling out his remaining explosive charges. "I'm going to create another distraction and get to that control booth. You two head for the ventilation system and don't look back. There's a maintenance shaft that leads to the docking bays. I scouted it on my way in." "We're not leaving you," said firmly. "This isn't a discussion," replied, his voice carrying the tone he'd used when they were small children pushing their bedtime. "I'm your father and I'm getting you to safety. That's the end of it." David grabbed his arm. "Dad, there are too many guards. If you go up there alone, you won't make it out." Smiled grimly. "Son, I didn't fight through the border wars and survive 5 years as a widower just to lose my children to a bunch of slavers. I've got a few tricks left." He handed David his plasma cutter and his backup sidearm, a compact energy pistol that would be easier for her to handle. "Remember what I taught you about covering fire and movement. Get to the docking bays and find a ship called the Wanderer's Rest. Tell Captain that sent you, and that it's time to collect on an old debt." Before either of his children could protest further, was moving. He sprinted toward the eastern wall where his first explosion had left a convenient pile of debris to use as cover. The guards immediately focused their fire on him, giving and David the opening they needed to reach the wall where the ventilation grating hung partially open from the earlier blast. Dove behind a chunk of twisted metal and started setting charges along the power conduits. The electrical system here was typical hegemony construction, efficient but not particularly robust. A series of small explosions in the right places would cascade through the entire network, shutting down everything from the lights to the security systems. Pulse fire continued to rain down around him as he worked, the guards growing bolder as reinforcements arrived. Could hear the heavy footsteps of hegemony troopers in full combat armor moving through the auction hall. Soon, they'd have the firepower to simply blow apart his cover and end this rescue attempt. The charges were set, looked up to see and David disappearing into the ventilation shaft, David helping his sister climb up first before following her into the darkness. Good. Whatever happened next, at least they had a chance. Triggered the explosives. The power conduits erupted in a shower of sparks and flame, plunging the auction hall into near-total darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on after a few seconds, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made the smoke and chaos look even more hellish. In the confusion, made his move toward the control booth. He could hear the slave collars shutting down with electronic whines as their control systems lost power. All around the auction hall, other slaves were realizing that their restraints had suddenly become nothing more than expensive jewelry. That was when everything started to go wrong. The slaves weren't just humans. The hegemony dealt in sentient species from across the galaxy, and some of those species had very specific reasons for hatting their captors. As the control collars powered down, creatures that had been suppressed and tormented for months or years suddenly found themselves free to act on their rage. A berserker, easily 3 meters tall and covered in natural armor plating, let out a roar that shook the walls and began systematically dismembering the nearest guards. A group of telepaths linked their minds and started broadcasting waves of psychic terror that sent several alien bidders into catatonic shock. Even worse, a void hunter that had been kept heavily sedated began to phase in and out of visible reality, appearing behind guards and auction house staff to deliver swift, silent death before vanishing again. Had wanted a distraction. What he'd gotten was a full-scale slave revolt with himself caught in the middle of it. The control booth suddenly seemed a lot farther away as the auction hall descended into absolute carnage. Pressed himself against the wall and tried to find a path through the madness, but escaped slaves and panicking guards were fighting running battles all around him. The air was filled with pulse fire, alien screams, and the acrid smell of ozone from overloaded energy weapons. He was halfway to the booth when a hegemony trooper in full combat armor spotted him. The soldier raised his rifle, but before he could fire, something massive and furry tackled him to the ground. Caught a glimpse of claws and fangs before the trooper's screaming was cut short with a wet tearing sound. Whatever species that had been, didn't want to stick around to find out if it could tell the difference between a hegemony soldier and a human father trying to rescue his children. The control booth's door was locked, but its plasma cutter made short work of the security mechanism. Inside, he found a terrified technician cowering behind a bank of monitors that showed the chaos unfolding throughout the auction hall. Most of the screens showed nothing but static or empty corridors as the facility's security systems failed. "Please don't hurt me," the technician wheezed, his 4 arms wrapped around his bulbous head. "I was just doing my job. I never wanted to work in the slave trade." Ignored him and began examining the control systems. The collar override was clearly labeled, but it required administrative access codes that he didn't have. However, his years working with mining equipment had taught him that most computer systems had physical backup controls for emergencies. He found what he was looking for behind an access panel, a manual shutdown switch that would disable every restraint device in the facility. The switch was protected by a clear cover with a warning label in multiple languages, but didn't hesitate. He smashed the cover with the butt of his rifle and threw the switch. Throughout the auction house, the few remaining active restraints powered down. Heard renewed screams and roars from the main hall as the last of the captive creatures found their freedom. The technician looked up at him with large, liquid eyes. "You have no idea what you've done," he said quietly. Some of those creatures, they weren't just slaves, they were prisoners, war criminals, monsters that the hegemony captured because they were too dangerous to be left free. Felt a chill run down his spine, but there was no taking it back now. "My children are somewhere in this facility," he said. "How do I get to the docking bays?" The technician's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy. "Level 7, Section 12. But human, the routes are not safe now. The facility is in complete lockdown, and there are things loose in the corridors that will kill anything they encounter." Before could respond, the lights went out completely. Emergency power was failing throughout the station as the cascade of system failures spread beyond what he'd originally intended. In the darkness, he could hear something scratching at the control booth door with claws that sounded like they could cut through steel. Checked his weapon's power level. Half a charge left, maybe enough for a few more shots. He looked at the terrified technician and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I'm sorry," he said, and left the technician alone in the darkened control booth as something began forcing its way through the door. The corridors of Nexus Station had become a nightmare maze of emergency lighting, failed security systems, and creatures that had every reason to hate anyone connected to their captivity. Moved as quietly as he could, trying to navigate toward the docking bays while avoiding the sounds of violence that echoed from all directions. He passed an intersection where the walls were scored with claw marks and covered in substances he didn't want to identify. A hegemony officer's uniform lay shredded in the corridor, but there was no body to be found. Stepped carefully around the remains and continued toward what he hoped was his destination. Level 7 was worse. The emergency lighting here had failed completely, leaving only the faint glow of burning debris to illuminate his path. Activated a small flashlight and immediately wished he hadn't. The beam revealed scenes of destruction that made the auction hall look peaceful by comparison. Something had systematically destroyed every security checkpoint and guard station, leaving behind only twisted metal and dark stains on the walls. Worse, could hear movement in the darkness ahead, something large dragging itself along the floor with a wet, sliding sound that made his skin crawl. He was beginning to understand what the technician had meant about releasing dangerous prisoners. The hegemony's slave trade wasn't just about economics. It was about controlling and containing threats to galactic order. By freeing everything indiscriminately, had potentially unleashed horrors that had been locked away for good reason. But he couldn't think about that now, and David were somewhere in this facility, trying to reach the docking bays with only his basic weapons training to protect them. He had to find them before something else did. Section 12 was supposed to be just ahead, but the corridor ended in a blast door that had been torn open from the inside. Whatever had broken through had left gouges in the reinforced metal that were deeper than his fingers. He squeezed through the gap and found himself in what had once been a security checkpoint. The guards' weapons were scattered across the floor, their energy cells drained, picked up a pulse rifle that looked functional and checked its charge. Empty. Whatever had come through here had been thorough in its destruction. A sound from behind made him spin around, raising his weapon before remembering it was useless. A figure emerged from the shadows and almost fired before recognizing the familiar outline. "Dad," David's voice was barely a whisper. Felt relief flood through him as his children emerged from their hiding place behind an overturned security desk. Was pale but unharmed, while David had a small cut on his forehead from their crawl through the ventilation system. "Are you both okay?" asked, quickly checking them for injuries. "We're fine," said, though her voice shook slightly. "But Dad, there are things in here with us. Horrible things. We saw something in the corridors that used to be a guard, but it was still moving." David nodded grimly. "The docking bays are just ahead, but there's something between us and the ships. We could hear it moving around in the dark." Processed this information. They were close to escape, but they'd have to get past whatever creature was guarding their exit route. With his weapon running low on power and no backup ammunition, their options were limited. "Stick close to me," he said. "We move quiet and fast. If something attacks, you two keep going to the ships and don't look back." They advanced through the darkened corridors as a family, each step bringing them closer to either freedom or disaster. Behind them, the sounds of violence and destruction continued to echo through Nexus Station as unintended revolution spread throughout the facility. He had broken his children's chains, But in doing so, he had unleashed something that might be far worse than the slavery they'd escaped. As they approached the final corridor leading to the docking bays, could only hope that their escape ship would still be waiting, and that captain was the kind of man who honored old debts even in the middle of a catastrophe. The docking bays lay ahead in the darkness, and with them, either salvation or the final confrontation that would determine whether the family lived to see another day. The docking bay stretched before them like a cavern carved from metal and shadows. Emergency lighting cast long red streaks across the floor, illuminating the skeletal frames of maintenance equipment and cargo containers. But it was what moved between those shadows that made its blood run cold. The creature was unlike anything in the xenobiology databases he'd studied during his military service. It had once been humanoid, but something had changed it into a nightmarish fusion of flesh and technology. Cybernetic implants sprouted from organic tissue like metallic tumors, while cables and wiring had grown through its body like a technological nervous system. Where its face should have been, a cluster of sensor arrays and data ports created a mechanical skull that tracked movement with predatory precision. Gripped his arm tightly as they watched the thing patrol between the docked ships. Its movements were unnaturally fluid, as if it was gliding rather than walking. Every few seconds it would pause and extend tendrils of circuitry that seemed to taste the air for electronic signatures. "What is that?" David whispered, barely breathing. Had heard rumors during his military days, stories about hegemony experiments that went wrong, criminals and prisoners used as test subjects for advanced cybernetic integration. The official reports always claimed such research was impossible, that the biological rejection of extensive implants made it impractical. Looking at the thing stalking through the docking bay, realized the official reports had been lies. "A converted," he said quietly. "The hegemony takes prisoners who can't be broken through normal means and tries to turn them into loyal servants through forced cybernetic enhancement. Most subjects die during the process. The ones who survive," he gestured toward the creature, "they become something that's no longer quite alive or dead." The converted had stopped moving and was slowly turning its sensor array toward their hiding position. Realized with growing dread that it had detected something, possibly the electromagnetic signatures of their own biological processes, or maybe the faint heat they were giving off in the cold docking bay. "We need to move," said. "Can you see the Wanderer's Rest from here?" Pointed toward a medium-sized cargo vessel docked near the far end of the bay. "That one, with the blue running lights." Nodded. The ship was maybe 50 meters away, but they'd have to cross open ground to reach it. And the converted was already moving toward their position, its mechanical components humming with barely audible electronic noise. "Run," said simply. They broke cover and sprinted across the docking bay floor, their footsteps echoing off the metal decking. Behind them, the converted let out a sound that was part electronic screech and part organic howl as it gave chase. Its movements became faster, more aggressive, and could hear the whir of internal mechanisms ramping up to combat speed. David reached the ship's boarding ramp first and immediately began working on the access panel, his fingers flying over the control interface. Reached him a moment later, turning to provide cover with the energy pistol had given her. Her hands shook, but she kept the weapon trained on the approaching threat. Was still 10 meters from the ship when the converted caught up to him. The thing moved with inhuman speed, closing the distance in a single bound that carried it through the air like a mechanical angel of death. Threw himself sideways, but cybernetic claws raked across his shoulder, tearing through his jacket and scoring the flesh beneath. He rolled and came up firing, his hunting rifle discharging pulse after pulse of coherent energy. The shot struck the converted's torso and sent sparks flying from damaged implants, but the creature barely slowed down. Whatever it had once been, pain was no longer a factor in its behavior. The converted's arm transformed as watched, mechanical components sliding and reconfiguring, until what had been a hand became a weapon that hummed with lethal energy. Dove behind a cargo container just as the weapon discharged, filling the air where he'd been standing with crackling electricity. "Dad's voice carried across the docking bay, high with panic. "Keep working on that door," shouted back, not taking his eyes off the creature as it stalked around the cargo container. "I'll handle this." But even as he said it, knew he was outmatched. His hunting rifle was down to its last few shots, and conventional weapons seemed to have little effect on the converted's hybrid physiology. Worse, he could hear more sounds of movement from the corridor they'd just left. The violence at the auction house was spreading throughout the station, and soon they'd have more than just one nightmarish guardian to deal with. The converted rounded the edge of the cargo container with its weapon charging for another shot, aimed for what looked like a critical power coupling and fired his last pulse, striking the target dead center. The creature staggered as electrical systems overloaded, but instead of falling, it began to adapt. Watched in horror as the damaged components were bypassed by new connections that grew like living metal across the converted's body. Backup systems came online, redundant pathways activated, and within seconds the creature was fully functional again. It had been designed to be virtually indestructible, a perfect fusion of biological resilience and mechanical redundancy. "Got it," David's voice echoed across the docking bay as the ship's boarding ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss. Looked back to see his children disappearing into the Wanderer's Rest. At least they'd be safe while he dealt with this monster. He dropped his empty rifle and pulled out a combat knife, knowing it was probably useless but unwilling to go down without a fight. The converted raised its weapon for what would certainly be a killing shot, but before it could fire, the entire docking bay was filled with the roar of ship engines coming online. The Wanderer's Rest was powering up, and Captain's voice boomed across the bay through external speakers. "You crazy bastard. When you said you might need that favor, I didn't expect it to involve a full-scale prison riot." Pulse cannon fire erupted from the ship's defensive weapons, striking the converted with military-grade firepower that made its hunting rifle look like a child's toy. The creature was thrown backwards by the impact, its cybernetic components sparking and failing as they overloaded beyond their ability to adapt. "Get your ass on this ship before more of those things show up," continued. "Because according to my sensors, this place is crawling with nasties that make that cyborg look like a house pet." Didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted for the boarding ramp as the converted tried to pull itself back together, its remaining functional systems attempting to root around the massive damage. Behind him, more shapes were emerging from the corridors, escaped slaves and prisoners of various species, but also things that easy classification. He reached the ship just as David appeared at the top of the ramp. David grabbed his hand and hauled him aboard while sealed the airlock behind them. Through the transparent aluminum viewport, could see the docking bay erupting into chaos as dozens of freed creatures poured in from the station's interior corridors. "Bridge now," Kame's voice over the ship's intercom. "We need to get out of here before station security locks down the docking clamps." They hurried through the ship's corridors, passing crew members who were securing equipment and preparing for immediate departure. Had served with during the border wars, and he knew the man ran a tight ship even under emergency conditions. The Wanderer's Rest might look like an ordinary cargo hauler, but it had been modified for situations exactly like this one. Was waiting for them on the bridge, his weathered face creased with concern as he monitored the tactical displays. He was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of steady hands that came from decades of flying in dangerous situations. When he saw, he clasped his old friend's shoulder with genuine relief. "Good to see you made it out," said. "Though I have to ask, what exactly did you do down there? My sensors are showing massive system failures throughout the station, and there are life signs moving through the corridors that don't match anything in the xenobiology databases." Felt a weight settle on his chest as he realized the full scope of what he'd unleashed. "I freed all the slaves," he said simply. "All of them, including whatever the hegemony was keeping locked up for reasons other than simple trafficking." His expression shifted to one of understanding and mild horror. "Jesus, do you have any idea what kind of things the hegemony classifies as too dangerous for normal incarceration?" Before could answer, the ship's tactical officer called out from her station. "Captain, we're getting multiple distress calls from across the sector. Nexus Station is broadcasting a general alert warning all ships to maintain distance. They're declaring the facility under total quarantine." Moved to stand beside her father, her face pale but determined. "What does that mean?" Pulled up a tactical display that showed the space around Nexus Station. "It means the hegemony is willing to sacrifice the entire facility and everyone on it to prevent whatever's been released from spreading. They'll probably use antimatter charges to sterilize the whole structure." David joined them at the display, his young face aging as he processed the implications. All those people still trapped on the station. The other slaves, the workers who weren't involved in the trafficking. Innocent people who'll die because of what I did, said quietly. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but he couldn't bring himself to regret saving his children. How long before they trigger the charges? Standard quarantine protocol is 2 hours, the tactical officer reported. That gives anyone with proper authorization time to evacuate before sterilization. Looked at the display showing the hundreds of ships docked at or near the station. Most were civilian vessels, traders and passenger haulers whose crews had no idea what was happening in the station's interior. In 2 hours, they'd all be destroyed along with whatever horrors he'd accidentally unleashed. We have to warn them, said suddenly. The other ships, the civilians, they don't deserve to die for this. Shook his head. Broadcasting a general warning would expose us to hegemony retaliation. They'll want to contain knowledge of what happened here, and that means eliminating witnesses. So we just leave. David's voice carried a note of challenge that reminded of his own stubborn streak. We save ourselves and let everyone else die. Felt the familiar weight of command decisions, the terrible mathematics of war where saving some lives meant sacrificing others. But this was different. This time, he was personally responsible for creating the crisis that threatened thousands of innocent people. He said slowly, what would it take to create a distraction big enough to give those civilian ships time to escape? His old friend's eyes narrowed as he considered the question. You're thinking of drawing the hegemony's attention away from the station. That would mean making ourselves targets. This ship isn't built for combat with military vessels. But it is built for running, pointed out. And you've got contacts in the smuggling networks, people who know how to disappear when the authorities come looking. Stepped forward, her voice carrying a note of urgency. There are children on those ships, families just trying to make honest livings. We can't let them die because we couldn't find another way to save ourselves. Looked between and his children, seeing the family resemblance in their shared determination to do what was right regardless of personal cost. After a long moment, he sighed and turned to his tactical officer. Patch me through to all civilian vessels in the area, he ordered. General frequency emergency broadcast. Sir, that will definitely attract hegemony attention, the officer warned. I know, said grimly, but sometimes you have to choose between being smart and being human, and I'd rather go down fighting than live with the alternative. The communication system activated, and its voice carried across the void to every ship within range of Nexus Station. Attention all civilian vessels. This is Captain of the Wanderer's Rest. You are in immediate danger. Nexus Station is under quarantine and scheduled for sterilization in approximately 90 minutes. Evacuate the area immediately and do not acknowledge this transmission. The response was immediate and chaotic. Ships that had been docked began emergency undocking procedures, while vessels in nearby space started moving away from the station at maximum acceleration. But could also see military vessels changing course to intercept the Wanderer's Rest, their weapons systems coming online as they prepared to silence the source of the unauthorized warning. Now comes the hard part, said, settling into his command chair. Helen, plot us a course for the asteroid field in System 7, best possible speed and prepare for combat maneuvering. The ship shuddered as its engines engaged at full power, pushing them away from Nexus Station and toward the relative safety of the asteroid field. Behind them, could see the civilian ships scattering in all directions like startled birds, while hegemony military vessels moved to pursue the most obvious targets. We're being hailed by a hegemony cruiser, the communications officer reported. They're ordering us to heave to for inspection. Tell them we're experiencing engine problems and can't comply, ordered. Buy us as much time as possible before they start shooting. And David stood beside their father, watching through the bridge viewports as the drama played out in the space around them. Nexus Station was already beginning to look smaller as they pulled away, but could see the telltale signatures of weapons fire as the escaped creatures fought running battles with station security throughout its corridors and docking bays. Dad said quietly, "Did we do the right thing?" Considered the question as he watched civilian ships fleeing to safety while military vessels moved to hunt them down. Innocent people were escaping with their lives, but at the cost of releasing unknown horrors into the galaxy, and making his family targets of the most powerful authority in known space. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I couldn't watch you and David being sold like property without fighting back, and I couldn't save you without freeing everyone else who was trapped in that place." "The hegemony cruiser is powering weapons," the tactical officer announced. "They're not buying the engine problem story." His hands flew over his controls, activating defensive systems and evasive maneuvering protocols. "You and your kids better strap in. This is about to get interesting." As the ship shook from the first impacts of hegemony weapons fire, realized that their problems were just beginning. They'd saved his children and given hundreds of civilians a chance to escape. But in doing so, they'd created a situation that would have consequences far beyond anything he'd intended. Behind them, Nexus Station continued its descent into chaos as things that should have remained imprisoned spread throughout its corridors. Ahead of them lay the uncertainty of life as fugitives from galactic law, with no safe harbor and no allies except old friends willing to risk everything for the bonds of loyalty. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the things they'd unleashed were beginning to spread beyond the station's hull, carried by escaping ships and refugee vessels toward worlds that had no idea what was coming for them. The revolution had accidentally started, was about to become something much larger and more dangerous than a simple slave revolt. And as the hegemony's weapons continued to pound their shields, he began to understand that sometimes saving the people you love means destroying the world you thought you knew. 3 months later, stood on the observation deck of Haven Station and watched the news feeds with growing dread. What had started as a rescue mission for his children had become a galactic catastrophe that showed no signs of stopping. The screens showed scenes from across hegemony space, burning colonies, quarantine systems, and military fleets engaged in desperate holding actions against threats that conventional understanding. The official news sources blamed terrorist organizations and rebel extremists, but knew the truth. He'd seen the passenger manifests from the ships that had escaped Nexus Station before its sterilization, and he'd tracked the spread of incidents that followed in their wake. Joined him at the viewport, her 16-year-old face showing a maturity that broke his heart. The past months as fugitives had forced both his children to grow up far too quickly, learning to live with constant vigilance and the knowledge that they were hunted across the galaxy. "The 442 system has gone dark," she reported quietly. "Complete communication blackout for the past 72 hours. Closed his eyes. 442 was their old home, the mining colony where this had all started. Whatever had been released from Nexus Station was systematically making its way through the outer territories, following trade routes and refugee pathways like a plague spreading through the galactic community. "Any word from David?" asked. Shook her head. "He's still tracking down leads on the remaining converted, but Dad, the reports they're sending back, it's getting worse, much worse." Over the past months, they'd learned more about what the hegemony had been keeping locked up in their high-security facilities. The converted were just the beginning, failed experiments in cybernetic integration that retained enough intelligence to be truly dangerous. But there had been other things in those cells, creatures and entities, that the hegemony had captured from the dark spaces between stars or the ruins of dead civilizations. Some were biological weapons left over from ancient wars, still carrying plagues that could corrupt entire biospheres. Others were artificial intelligences that had been imprisoned for attempting to transcend their original programming in ways that threatened organic life. Worst of all were the void-touched, beings that had encountered something in deep space that changed them into living conduits for forces that shouldn't exist in normal reality. Had freed them all without understanding what they were or what they were capable of. And now they were spreading across the galaxy like a cancer, each one carrying its own particular brand of horror to previously peaceful worlds. "Sir," a young technician approached hesitantly, carrying a data tablet with obvious reluctance. "We've received another transmission from the resistance networks. They're asking for your response to the hegemony's latest offer." Took the tablet and read the message that had been bounced through a dozen encrypted relay stations to reach them. The hegemony was offering full amnesty for his family in exchange for his cooperation in containing the crisis he'd created. They wanted him to help track down the escaped entities, using his knowledge of the prison break to locate and recapture the most dangerous specimens. It was the same offer they'd made a dozen times before, each time with slightly better terms as the situation grew more desperate. The latest version even included promises of citizenship restoration and monetary compensation for their suffering. All he had to do was help them clean up his mess. "Tell them the same thing I told them last time," said, handing back the tablet. "No deal." Looked at him with confusion and perhaps a hint of frustration. "Dad, maybe we should consider it. The amnesty offer includes David, and they're promising to help relocate the civilian refugees to safe systems." Understood her reasoning. The past 3 months had been hard on all of them, living as fugitives in the neutral territories while watching the galaxy burn around them. And David deserved normal lives, not an existence spent running from system to system with false identities and constant fear of discovery. But also understood what the hegemony wasn't saying in their offer. They didn't want his help to contain the escaped entities. They wanted him as a scapegoat, someone to blame for the crisis while they implemented even more authoritarian measures to maintain control. Once they had him in custody, his family would become leverage to ensure his cooperation, and the cycle of oppression would continue with his children as the next generation of victims. "The hegemony created this situation by turning sentient beings into commodities," said firmly. "They imprisoned horrors that should have been destroyed or studied safely, also they could profit from suffering. I won't help them rebuild that system." "But people are dying," pointed out. "Innocent people who had nothing to do with the slave trade or the prison facilities. Don't we have a responsibility to help them?" It was the question that kept awake at night. Every day brought new reports of colonies going silent, civilian ships destroyed by things that shouldn't exist, and military forces overwhelmed by enemies they couldn't understand or combat effectively. His decision to save his children had condemned thousands of others to fates worse than slavery. Before he could answer his question, alarms began sounding throughout Haven Station. Emergency lights activated, and the station's defensive systems powered up as automated voices began broadcasting evacuation orders. "Unknown contacts approaching from hyperspace," the station's controller announced over the intercom. "All civilian personnel report to emergency shelters immediately. This is not a drill." And rushed to the command center, where they found Captain and David working frantically at the tactical displays. Looked up as they entered, his face grim with concern. "We've got multiple hyperspace signatures incoming," reported. "Configuration matches hegemony pursuit squadrons, but there's something else with them, something big." David turned from his console, his young face pale with fear. "Dad, it's not just military ships. There are civilian vessels in that formation, but their transponders are broadcasting hegemony identification codes." Felt ice form in his stomach as he understood the implications. Converted ships. They've turned entire crews into those cyborg things. The tactical display updated as the approaching fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. What they saw belief, dozens of vessels that had once been normal civilian craft, now modified with hegemony technology and crewed by beings that were no longer entirely alive. At the center of the formation was a massive dreadnought that recognized from intelligence briefings as the pride of hegemony, one of their most advanced warships. "They're hailing us," the communications officer reported. "Put it through," ordered. The main screen activated to show a figure that had once been human, but was now something far more disturbing. Admiral Sarah, Zone's sister, who had disappeared during a hegemony diplomatic mission 5 years earlier, stood on the bridge of the Pride of Hegemony. But like the creature they'd encountered in the docking bay, she had been transformed into a hybrid of flesh and machine. "Hello," she said, her voice carrying electronic harmonics that made it barely recognizable. "It's time we had a family reunion." Gasped and took an involuntary step backward. "Aunt Sarah." Sarah's cybernetic eyes focused on with predatory precision. "My dear niece, you've grown so much since I last saw you. The hegemony has been very interested in your family's unique genetics. Your resistance to conventional conditioning makes you valuable research subjects." Felt rage building in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm. "What do you want, Sarah?" "The same thing we've always wanted," Sarah replied. "Order, stability, an end to the chaos you've unleashed across our space. You freed things that were imprisoned for good reason, brother. Now those entities are spreading across the galaxy, corrupting everything they touch." The tactical display showed what she meant. The fleet approaching Haven Station included ships that were clearly no longer under conventional control. Some moved with the fluid grace of living creatures, their hulls pulsing with organic growths that had integrated with their mechanical systems. Others flickered in and out of normal space as void-touched entities exerted their influence over reality itself. You see, Sarah continued, we tried to contain these horrors through conventional imprisonment, but you've forced us to adopt more direct methods of control. The converted represent evolution, the next step in galactic civilization. David stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. She's not Aunt Sarah anymore, is she, Dad? Shook his head sadly. The person she was is gone. What's left is just the hegemony's idea of what she should be. Sarah smiled, an expression made horrifying by the mechanical components that had replaced parts of her face. I am more than I was, nephew. More efficient, more logical, more capable of making the difficult decisions necessary to preserve order. And soon, you'll understand the benefits of integration as well. The fleet was moving into attack formation, but noticed something strange about their positioning. The converted ships were hanging back while the pride of hegemony moved forward alone. It was almost as if Sarah's vessel was protecting the rest of the fleet from something rather than preparing to attack. The hegemony is offering you one final chance, Sarah continued. Surrender yourselves for integration, and we'll ensure that your consciousness remains relatively intact during the process. You'll become part of something greater than your individual selves. Was monitoring the tactical sensors and suddenly looked up with alarm. I'm reading massive gravitational distortions throughout the system. Something's coming through hyperspace, and it's bigger than anything in our databases. The main display flickered as new contacts appeared on the sensors. What emerged from hyperspace was unlike any ship design in known civilization. A massive construct that seemed to be grown rather than built, its organic curves pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Devourers, Sarah whispered, and for the first time since her transformation, her voice carried a note of genuine fear. They followed the trail. Had heard whispers about the Devourers in the deepest classified files he'd accessed during his military service. Ancient entities that existed in the void between galaxies, attracted by the use of certain technologies or the presence of specific types of consciousness. The hegemony's experiments had apparently drawn their attention, and now they'd come to investigate. The alien construct moved with purpose toward the pride of hegemony, and as it approached, the converted ships began to malfunction. Their hybrid organic-mechanical systems were reacting to the Devourer's presence, creating feedback loops that caused painful transformations in their crews. Sarah, get your people out of here, called out, temporarily forgetting their enmity in the face of this greater threat. Whatever that thing is, it's not something we can fight. But Sarah was no longer listening to him. Her attention was focused on maintaining control of her fleet as the Devourer's influence spread throughout their formation. The converted crews were experiencing system failures that went beyond mere mechanical breakdowns. Their consciousness itself was being examined and found wanting by an intelligence that operated on principles beyond human understanding. All ships prepare for emergency withdrawal, Sarah ordered, but her commands were being ignored as individual vessels began to transform under the Devourer's scrutiny. What had been carefully controlled hybrid entities became chaotic amalgamations of consciousness, technology, and organic matter that followed no recognizable pattern. The Devourer sent out a communication pulse that bypassed all conventional translation protocols and spoke directly to the minds of everyone in the system. Its message was simple and terrifying. The experiment has failed. The subjects will be recycled. Understood with crystal clarity that humanity, all of humanity, had just been classified as a failed experiment by beings whose understanding of reality dwarfed their own. The hegemony's attempts to create order through technological control had attracted the attention of entities that saw such efforts as crude and primitive. How fast can we get out of this system? Asked. Not fast enough, replied grimly. That thing is generating some kind of interdiction field. Hyperspace is locked down throughout the system. Grabbed her father's arm. Dad, what do we do? Looked around the command center at the people who had risked everything to help his family. And his crew, the refugees from other failed worlds, his children who deserved a chance at life that didn't involve running from cosmic horrors. They were all depending on him to find a solution to a problem that existed on a scale beyond human comprehension. "We do what humans have always done when faced with impossible odds," said finally. "We adapt, we survive, and we make sure our children have a better future than the one we're leaving them." He turned to the communications console and opened a channel to every ship in the system, hegemony, civilian, and alien alike. "This is, to all vessels in the system, we're facing something that sees all of our conflicts as irrelevant. The hegemony's experiments, my prison break, the war between us, none of it matters to that thing out there." The Devourer was beginning its recycling process, and the pride of hegemony was caught in energies that were breaking down the barriers between consciousness, matter, and technology. Sarah's final transmission was a scream that carried across multiple dimensions of reality as her hybrid existence was unmade and reformed into something that served the Devourer's incomprehensible purposes. "We have maybe minutes before it turns its attention to the rest of us," continued. "I'm transmitting the technical specifications for every entity that escaped from Nexus Station, along with the locations of other hegemony research facilities. Use that information however you see fit, to hunt down the escaped horrors, to free more prisoners, or to build weapons against the things that see us as test subjects." He paused, looking at and David as they stood beside him. "I broke the chains that held my children, and in doing so I broke chains that should have stayed locked. But slavery is still slavery, whether it's imposed by the hegemony or by things from outside our galaxy that see us as laboratory animals." The Devourer had finished with the pride of hegemony and was moving toward the converted fleet. Each ship it touched was transformed into something that retained elements of its original form, but served purposes that human minds couldn't grasp. The process looked horrifically painful for any consciousness that was caught in the transformation. "The data upload is complete," reported. "Every ship in the system has received the information." Nodded and opened one final channel, this one directed at the Devourer itself. He had no idea if the entity would understand or care about his words, but he had to try. "We are not your experiments," he said clearly. "We are not subjects for your recycling. We are human beings and we choose our own fate." The response was immediate and devastating. The Devourer's attention focused on Haven Station like a searchlight made of pure consciousness, and felt his mind being examined by an intelligence that spanned dimensions. For a brief moment, he saw reality from the Devourer's perspective, countless galaxies filled with civilizations that rose and fell according to patterns too vast for individual comprehension. But in that moment of contact, something unexpected happened. The Devourer paused in its recycling process and felt a flicker of what might have been surprise from the alien consciousness. In all its eons of existence, it had never encountered a species that chose defiance over submission when faced with cosmic irrelevance. The interdiction field around the system suddenly collapsed, and hyperspace became accessible again. The Devourer transmitted one final message before withdrawing into the void between dimensions. "Interesting. The experiment will continue." Around them, ships began jumping to hyperspace as fast as their drives could cycle. The remaining hegemony vessels fled toward their core territories, while civilian craft scattered in all directions carrying data about the escaped entities and hidden research facilities. "Did we just win?" David asked uncertainly. Watched the last traces of the Devourer's presence fade from the sensors. "I don't think that entity recognizes the concept of winning or losing the way we understand it, but we're still alive and we're still free to make our own choices. That's something." Hugged him tightly. "What happens now?" Looked out at the stars where hundreds of ships were carrying information that would reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. Some would use the data to hunt down the horrors he'd released, while others would use it to strike against hegemony facilities and free more prisoners. The galaxy was going to become a much more dangerous place, but it was also going to be a place where individuals could fight back against systems that treated them as property. "Now we go home," said. "Not to any specific world, but to wherever humans are trying to build something better than what came before, and we help them do it." Was already plotting their course to the outer territories, where human colonies were forming beyond hegemony control. They would take the family somewhere safe, and then continue the work of helping other families escape the slavery and oppression that had torn their galaxy apart. As the Wanderer's rest jumped into hyperspace, reflected on the price of the freedom they'd won. Thousands were dead, Entire systems were in chaos, and cosmic entities now saw humanity as an interesting anomaly worth preserving. But in David were safe, and across the galaxy, the chains that bound countless others were being broken by people who had learned that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The revolution had accidentally started was spreading beyond anything he could have imagined. And while he couldn't predict where it would lead, he knew that his children would grow up in a galaxy where they had the chance to choose their own destiny rather than having it imposed on them by others. Sometimes that was the best any father could hope for,